the U.S. House passes silencer deregulation, plus the Supreme Court turns down more cases dealing with gun rights for nonviolent felons. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The reload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. The big news we want to kick off with this week is obviously the ongoing saga over the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, budget reconciliation time. And, the non-economic side, there actually is some pretty big gun news that happened because the package that cleared the House of Representatives actually included not just the removal of the tax on suppressors that we spoke about, I think, last episode, but actually full-on delisting from the NFA for suppressors. So pretty big achievement for gun rights advocates.
Yes. So certainly getting it in there was maybe a win for the gun rights advocates in this case. All the gun rights groups are essentially on the same side here after the way. So as we talked about last week, the House Ways and Means Committee, Republicans added the elimination of the tax on the transfer of silencers, not on making of silencers. There's also an NFA, National Firearms Act, tax on making. So if you make your own, you would have still had to pay that tax. Now, that set off a big blow up between the gun rights groups and House Ways and Means Committee Republicans, because gun rights groups wanted, as you just mentioned, full delisting of silencers, essentially the Hearing Protection Act. They wanted that added, the full thing, to this bill, and also for the makings tax to go away on silencers, at least. Now, they also wanted to add what's called the Short Act to this bill, which would do the same thing, but for short barrel rifles and shotguns. That did not get included. But the Hearing Protection Act provisions did. Delisting of silencers from the National Firearms Act is now included in this budget bill, which, as you mentioned, President Trump calls the Big Beautiful Bill. I guess that's better marketing than just omnibus, which is what it is. It's just a giant bill. Every potentially budget-related thing the Republican Party wants to do. And, it's a multi-trillion-dollar bill, right? And so this aspect has about a $1.4 billion impact on revenue over the course of 10 years. So a pretty small portion of this bill is actually tied up in this situation. Now, the reason that I said it may be a big win is, and I wrote about this for members of the weekend, the whole dispute over this between the Ways and Means Republicans and which, by the way, we were supposed to have Rep. Kustoff on. He was supposed to be on last week and he was supposed to be on this week. He, again, was not able to make it this week. They still say that he will be on. Will join us perhaps next week. They're blaming scheduling conflicts. We'll see if they follow through on that. Obviously, I told him, look, I'm happy to do the interview. It's be good to do the interview. He's one of the people at the center of this whole fight in the House. People, it's like people are going to start to think that he's trying to duck the interview if he doesn't actually come on at some point. So we'll see what happens with that, and obviously keep up to date with it. They say that he does want to come on, so I'll certainly give him the benefit of the doubt on that, and hopefully we'll have him on to talk about this next week. But anyway, the dispute between House Ways and Means Republicans, not just Kustoff, but really the whole committee, and the gun groups, centered around whether or not delisting silencers from the NFA is actually going to be possible through reconciliation, right? Now, I will say that this is their best shot at getting silencers delisted from the National Firearms Act. This is the best opportunity that the gun groups have, because reconciliation, as we walked through last week, it's a complex bit of legislative maneuvering, but effectively it allows you to pass bills through the Senate with a bare majority instead of needing to overcome a filibuster by 60 votes. So if you tried to pass the Hearing Protection Act as a standalone bill through normal legislative process, you would very certainly have to clear that 60 vote threshold to defeat a filibuster in the Senate. And as of now, the Hearing Protection Act has not had a single Democratic co-sponsor. It's never gotten a vote in the Senate, I think, ever, if I'm remembering correctly. We had Senator Crapo on, who's one of the co-sponsors of that bill in the Senate not too long ago, and he was not optimistic that it was going to get to 60 votes. He was optimistic they could get a few Democratic votes on it, but they need 7 if they could hold on to all 53 Republicans, which is also not completely certain. So, realistically, you're not going to get the Hearing Protection Act. You're not going to get silencer delisting from the NFA through regular order. It's not even clear that you could get it through the House as a standalone bill, honestly. I think they had trouble getting the House Ways and Means Republicans, from the sources that I spoke to involved with that, with the crafting of the tax cut that was initially part of the bill. They said it was difficult to get just that through the Ways and Means Committee, because there's some Republicans who aren't in support of the Hearing Protection Act, of delisting, or even of just cutting the tax to zero. In fact, I think Congressman Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania's 6th, the Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, I think he didn't vote on that provision at all. Like he wasn't in the committee room when that vote happened, as sort of a, maneuvering that was required to get the text through the bill. So there's some question as to whether or not a standalone Hearing Protection Act could even pass the House, because the margins are so thin there. I think it's a 3-vote margin in the House right now, maybe 4. We just had Congressman, was it Connolly, I think, passed away just recently. So the margin might be slightly larger now, but it's still not sure. There is one Democratic co-sponsor of the Hearing Protection Act in the House, but regardless, you get the idea. It's a very close call as to whether you could pass it through either chamber or whether you could pass it through the House, and you definitely couldn't pass it through the Senate under normal order. So reconciliation is the best path, or is you could probably get 50 votes in the Senate for it, especially if it's part of a much larger must-pass bill like this budget bill, right? That's the idea here. And this is what we've talked about since the beginning of the year, since the election. The margins aren't there to pass these things on their own. The best shot you're going to have is bundling them together with a much larger bill that needs to pass, which is exactly what's happening here. And so the logic of it, or the strategy of it, makes a lot of sense, right? And it's clear why the gun rights groups wanted to do it this way. The problem, though, comes in what was at the core of this fight between Ways and Means Republicans and the gun groups, which was the idea that the reason you only need 50 votes in the Senate for reconciliation is that there's a special process in place to ensure that only budget measures are actually included as part of these bills. The senators are giving up their right to filibuster essentially in exchange to do this process. And so there are strict rules about what can be included and what can't. There's called extraneous matters can't be added to bills like this. And there's a 6-part rule called the Byrd Rule on, what can and can't be in there. And they House Ways and Means Republicans think, they've they looked into this, into trying the full fat, HPA, the silencer delisting. At the beginning of the year when they were starting off on this, Kustov especially, and they came to the conclusion that it wouldn't pass the Byrd rule, because the idea with the Byrd rule is that it's supposed to be limiting provisions to just things that have a primarily a budgetary impact. And so you can't include things where if there is one, there isn't any budgetary impact, and two, if the budgetary impact is ancillary to what you're actually trying to accomplish with the measure. So, kind of anything you do to federal law could have, in theory, some kind of financial impact, right? But if the goal is clearly to get something else accomplished, that where the whatever budgetary impact there may be is sort of ancillary to that goal, it'll be stripped out by what's called the Senate parliamentarian. So this decision is made by what is sort of a third party objective official who's, and that probably sounds like it's not a real thing that happens with the way how polarized our politics are, but the Senate parliamentarian is a lot like the filibuster in the sense that it actually is one of those things that both sides are wary about messing with too much, because they understand that down the line it'll come back and bite them the next time the other party is in control if you just eliminate these various safeguards for the minority. And that's essentially what this is. What the parliamentarian does is ensure that the majority is not just cramming in anything to this reconciliation bill. If you blow up the parliamentarian, then you kind of are almost effectively eliminating the filibuster, because you can just do anything through reconciliation. Then the filibuster doesn't matter anymore. So there's a lot of there's a lot of hesitance in trying to do too much with the parliamentarian. Although Senate Republicans right now did just vote to sort of override the parliamentarian, and at least in one specific respect, to a different process called the Congressional Review Act, in order to eliminate California's emissions standards for cars. And that was controversial. That was very controversial. I think that's a much, at least Republicans are saying that it's a much more limited, move against the parliamentarian so these things get kind of extremely wonky, I guess. But the bottom line here is the concern is over whether or not delisting silencers from the National Firearms Act is primarily a budgetary issue, or whether it'll get washed out in what's called the Byrd. There's fun little terms for these things. The Byrd bath is when they go through the bill and senators can object to different provisions. Any senator can object. So I can guarantee that one of the Democratic senators is going to object to this part of the bill, and then it'll be up to the parliamentarian whether or not it'll get washed out in what they call the Byrd bath, because it's called the Byrd rule. And while that rule is named after a senator from a long time ago, obviously it's Byrd bath is a funny little word. So anyway, that process is the core dispute here. Whether or not delisting silencers makes it through the Byrd rule is kind of the whole thing. Because both sides of this fight, and I've talked to half a dozen sources on either side of this dispute, with the gun groups or with Ways and Means Republicans or some of the other people who were working on the bill in Ways and Means, and they all seem to agree that eliminating the tax fits under the Byrd rule, because it's just straight budgetary issue. You get rid of the tax, it costs about $1.4 billion over 10 years. And that's it. Now, what the gun groups say, their argument is that the NFA is a tax. The whole thing is a tax, right? That's how it works. You're levying a tax on these different items, and then the other provisions of the NFA are just essentially enforcement mechanisms for that tax. So you pay the tax stamp, and then the registry that you have to include your gun in with the ATF is just a registry of who has paid the tax stamp, right? That's what the registry is. And so their argument is because this whole thing is a tax, that eliminating or at least partially repealing it is a purely budgetary measure and should pass the Byrd rule. And there have been numerous federal courts, including the Supreme Court, that have weighed in arguing, labeling the NFA as a tax. And so they think the parliamentarians should and will take that legal determination into account when deciding this. Now, on the other side, the Ways and Means side, they say that because the goal with delisting is not revenue related, the goal is to get rid of the burden of having to register the items, that the parliamentarian is going to view that as non-budgetary. And it doesn't really matter if the Supreme Court or others have called the law, it's the overall law, a tax. What matters is the outcome of the provision and what the goal of the provision is. And they claim to have consulted with, former parliamentarians and others with understanding of how the current parliamentarian thinks. And, they've come to the conclusion, or they've been told that essentially it's not going to work, that it'll be thrown out by the parliamentarian. And I've had a number of people say that that's the case. And so that's where things stand. I don't know who's right on that dispute. Like, I can't tell, obviously I think if it's true that these, the people from Ways and Means are involved in the crafting of that section of the bill have spoken to experts on the issue, and they came to the conclusion that it's not workable. I think what the parliamentarian says matters. And whoever has better insight into that is probably the one who's right. But it's, certainly I can see the logic of the gun rights groups here. It's a tax bill. The registration is just an enforcement mechanism for the tax. Eliminating or at least parts of it, they didn't get everything they wanted. They didn't get short bail rifles. It can, on that point, by the way, you can add things in the Senate. The Senate is basically going to take several weeks here to rewrite this whole bill. Now, how much they can rewrite is an open question, because if they come up with a totally different deal than what the House passed, then they have to go back to the House and get that. And it's with the margins as they are. I don't know how much change the Senate's going to make. Although this part of the deal, the fact that it's a very small part of this trillions of dollars in budgeting probably cuts both ways, in that it's small enough that it isn't maybe going to be something that keeps anybody from voting for it. That's why putting it in a budget bill helps get traction. Like, maybe this wouldn't have passed the House on its own, but as part of this much larger deal, the people opposed to it in the House caucus, they're probably not going to stick their neck out and block the whole bill over it, right? And so that's one potential advantage. But it's also a potential downside, because it's such a small thing that, if heat gets turned up hot enough on Republicans over this in the Senate, they might not see it as worth the squeeze and find some other way to use that $1.5 billion to put towards, preventing some Medicaid program from being cut or something. That's the bigger issue at play here, right? Is like Medicare cuts, SALT deductions, those sorts of things are the top line disputes. And this is further down the list of priorities, but the gun rights groups did pull off enough of a coup to get what they wanted in the bill. The question now becomes, what they wanted going to survive this bureaucratic process in the Senate. And I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. Now, I will say they still have the tax elimination aspect in there, in addition to the delisting, which is another maybe problem. Like, is the Senate going to see that as germane? Like, how can you lower the tax on the thing that you also are just eliminating from the law altogether? That's another potential pain point that I've seen brought up. I don't know how that will work out. And then, there is this idea that even if they strip delisting from this bill, that you would still have the tax cut as a fallback, because everyone seems to agree that the tax cut is likely to pass the Byrd rule. But there is some concern, at least from the Ways and Means side of this, that the parliamentarian might strike the entire thing altogether, and you get nothing at that point. I don't know. I don't know how that's going to work out. That's what we're going to see what happens here in the Senate. And then it's something of a gamble that the gun rights groups have undertaken here. It's one that I get, you get it as far as the potential reward for taking this gamble. They also thrashed those Ways and Means Republicans, so I think were caught off guard by how much pushback they got in public, and it could make them less likely to try something like this again in the future. I think from their perspective, you've seen this process happened back in 2017, right? Last time Republicans had control, and nobody tried to put any sort of gun-related provisions into the budget bill back then. And so this was sort of the first time that somebody has tried to do this, and they got blown up over it. Now, I've also heard so there's some, I think they're not super happy about that, obviously, how that worked out for them. But at the same time, they did put out a bill that everybody on the gun rights side was unhappy with, it seems, or at least clearly thought they should have tried to go further. And whatever the communication there, it wasn't good enough, I guess, on either side of that, because, they didn't, I don't think they expected this level of public outcry. And so maybe they should have talked more to the gun rights groups and vice versa to be on closer together on this. But, they certainly concluded that what the gun rights groups are trying to do is not going to work. And so they were trying to get something else, trying to get what they thought they could get. And so that's what's going to come down. Who's right on this may make a difference in the end, just from the idea of, like, if the gun rights group savaged these guys and then they turn out to be wrong, that probably damages a lot of relationships. But if they turn out to be right, I don't know that even if it does still lead to some of these House Republicans being upset with them, I don't know that they'll care that much, because they got one of the top priorities for the gun rights movement of the last several decades.
Yeah,
I think, so that's like a summary of what is going on and what the stakes are. I should maybe mention a couple of the practical outcomes here. Like, what happens if this actually gets through the Senate and gets to the president's desk and he signs it, which, by the way, we're still weeks off from that, most likely. I think July is what they've set for the deadline for this bill to be, and that's sort of a self-imposed deadline, which is not, those don't always hold up. We'll see. Mm-hmm. There's supposedly a lot of still, the Senate kind of wants to put its own mark on the bill, and there's a lot of people unhappy with how much this adds to the debt, and the bond market kind of went a bit nuts on reacting to this bill, where I think bond yields were pushed way up in response to how much this was going to add to the deficit. So the Senate may, I don't know. We'll see what they do with it. And we will certainly keep an eye on what happens with this particular portion of it. But But yeah, I mean, so for one, it's a long way off before this becomes finalized. But two, what the language it does right now is removes just silencers. Sounds, obviously, people prefer to call them sound suppressors. I use the term silencer often because that's what more people know. It's what the term is in the National Firearms Act. It's what the inventor called them, so on and so forth. It's a marketing term. It's misleading. They don't completely silence firearms, but they more suppress the sound to a certain degree. But regardless, just to get that out of the way, because I'm sure some people may bring it up in the comments, but it would delist silencers from the National Firearms Act, which means you would no longer have to pay the tax, and then also you would not have to go through the registration process. And essentially, they would fall back to the Gun Control Act, is my understanding of this. So you would still have to go through a background check to purchase one, but it would be more like if you went in and bought a regular gun from a gun store. Now, I will say, it's become closer to that already because the processing time has long been the complaint about NFA items, and the processing time on silencers has been reduced significantly in the last couple of years with the online registration process. But you do still have to do fingerprinting and a bunch of stuff you don't have to do when you go and buy just a regular gun from a gun store. So essentially it would treat silencers the way that guns are treated, which has long been the goal of the gun rights movement with this stuff. So significant there. Now it doesn't undo the state bans that exist. So there's a number of blue states that just have banned possession of silencers, right? And so that won't change anything. It's just federal law. There may be some adverse effect on some states, depending on how your state law is written, because I think some states, there's a handful of states that require you to go through the NFA process to legally possess the gun. And if the silencers to legally possess silencers. And if they aren't in the NFA anymore, there may be an issue there. In fact, I think maybe Colorado might be one of those.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure Colorado statute is phrased that way, where it's default silencers are banned in the state. However, if you have I think they call it a federal permit to own it, you're allowed to have it, which I think they're referring obviously to the NFA tax stamp in that instance. So that actually is an interesting ramification. I haven't thought about what that would mean for states like Colorado and others.
So there may be some work to do on that front for gun rights activists, if they do get this bill with the text as written, because that's another thing that you probably couldn't get that through reconciliation, even if you can eliminate the tax because or you can delist them because it's a tax bill. Maybe that's the logic they're using now, but changing anything else about how they're regulated may be a bridge too far. So they may require fixes in some states. I don't know. Well, that's my understanding of it. I don't know exactly which states, but I did hear Colorado was one example of it. Anyway, so that's what would happen. Now, if the delisting gets removed, but the tax cut remains, what'll happen is silencers will remain part of the NFA, but you won't have to pay a tax, or the tax will be $0. The tax stamp will cost you $0. And that would be for both the transfer, which means that when you buy a silencer, and also making. So if you do use a homemade silencer and you want to legally register it, that would also cost $0. And I think that wasn't included again in the first round because there was concern that it wouldn't be able to get through the committee. Because of the connection to the United Healthcare shooting, although obviously the United Healthcare shooter, the alleged shooter there, he 3D printed a silencer, but he didn't try to register. He just didn't care about the law in question, right? And he also brought it in New York, where it would have been illegal for him to have, regardless. But there's sensitivities around that, or that is a major issue that complicates the whole situation. As we talked to Senator Crapo about that when we had him on the show. People should listen to that full interview, by the way. But it was on News Update a couple months back. But anyway, yeah. So that you would still have to go through the rest of the paperwork and comply with all the other regulations of the National Firearms Act, but the tax would be $0, which does call into question like the logic of the law itself, because again, it is a tax law, and the other regulations surrounding these items have to do with showing that you've paid the tax. And so if the tax is $0, that might make it more vulnerable in court too, honestly. We saw that with the Biden administration and their pistol brace rule, because when they reclassified pistol brace firearms as SBRs, they waived the tax for registration in that situation as well. And there were some legal challenges that incorporated that argument that this doesn't make sense because the NFA, the whole purpose of it is the tax. So, anyway, those would be the practical outcomes. And again, it all comes down to, I guess, who you believe is right in terms of what the parliamentarian will do here. And we will certainly continue to try and find out. The parliamentarian, I don't believe, puts out like public rulings until the actual issue is brought up to them. So there's rumors about what they might do, or there's like I said, the Ways and Means is talk to people who have an understanding of what the parliamentarian's thinking is, or they've talked to former parliamentarians, that sort of thing, to try and to formulate their view of it. But we don't know for sure what the parliamentarian is going to do. And we don't know how the Senate is going to handle this either. So we will be doing more reporting on that as this progresses, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, still several weeks, if not months, to go on this before we have a resolution. But nevertheless, still a pretty big story, and probably the best chance, like you mentioned, best chance in probably decades for gun rights advocates to get a major policy victory in the halls of Congress. So
it's the best chance, and so you can understand why they're taking the risk on it. Whether or not they have the right position as in regards to the parliamentarian, I don't know. But you can certainly see why they're pushing, why they all came to the same conclusion that we should try this, and why they weren't. Some of them, especially Gun Owners America, National Association for Gun Rights, went very hard after Kustoff and the other Ways and Means Republicans over this, and they did get the other House Republicans to and House leadership to include this in the final bill. So they got what they were looking to get. It's just a question of whether or not that's the right strategy. That's what the Ways and Means Republicans that's what their counter argument is. So we'll see what happens, and we will keep on talking. And I know we've taken up a lot of the podcast talking about this, but it is, like I said, I think this is probably the only chance you get a major change to federal gun law in this Congress. And, with the way the first couple, months of the Trump administration have gone, especially if you look at his approval rating, it's hard to predict what will happen in the midterms, but the House is already at paper thin margins, and the president's party tends to lose seats regardless. And if the president's polling numbers are very bad at the time of the midterms, it's unlikely that they're going to hold on to the House. And they probably lose seats in the Senate too, but that's a long way off. But I would still say, given where the mechanics are today, and the fact that in election years like next year, you don't tend to see a lot of controversial legislation getting through Congress, this is probably the big shot. So that's why I've spent so much time talking about it. This is it. What happens here, even if you just get the tax cut, honestly, it's going to be the biggest pro-gun reform of federal law, even if it isn't, massive undertaking. It's probably the most substantial thing that pro-gun change to federal law in decades. So that's why we're focusing so much on it.
Yeah, absolutely. But outside of the halls of Congress, we also had some legal news this week, sort of in a similar vein to what we've seen in weeks past from the Supreme Court. This week, as Monday of this week, as of our recording, they released another orders list and essentially just cleared their plate of a whole host of pending felon in possession challenges. This is obviously a topic we've covered a lot because it's been one of the most hotly contested, speaking of federal gun law, hotly contested federal gun laws on the books in litigation. And they specifically rejected 7 cases this week, including one that has been sort of on their docket, off and on their docket for the past few years. It was appealed by the previous DOJ. They GVR'd it after Rahimi. They grant vacated and remanded it, sent it back down to the lower court. Lower court decided the same exact thing. It made its way back up, and the Supreme Court nevertheless decided, actually, we decided we don't want to do anything with this case.
Yeah. What was the point of that GVR, I guess, now that we're thinking about this? I mean, they came back with the same conclusion, and the court was like, all right, never mind. It's fine.
That's essentially right. Yeah.
It's just like made them do extra work for no reason. I don't know. The court's always an interesting thing to try and suss out what the heck they're thinking about these issues. And they relisted the big cases again. Snope and Ocean State Tactical, the assault weapons ban and magazine limit cases still sitting in purgatory right now. But yeah, you'd written a piece for members about, the idea that the court is very well set up to take one of these felon in possession cases. And, they just punted on doing that again, right?
Yeah. And so they're very well set up to do it. And there's this interesting dynamic that's sort of blooming now with the Trump DOJ's preferred approach to these particular cases. Because like you said, in theory, you would think that the court would be eager and anxious to take one of these cases because there is an active circuit split amongst the federal appeals courts. It's the most commonly charged federal gun law in the country. So it's obviously a very important statute from the perspective of law enforcement and from the perspective of defendants who are charged under this law. It's usually about 8,000 a year. So it's not insignificant. But nevertheless, the DOJ has filed a series of briefs in these pending cases, including one of the cases that the court just rejected this week, essentially telling the justices, hey, guys, we don't think this is worth your time. We know there's a circuit split, but we think it's just a itty bitty thing. It's not a big deal. Oh, and by the way, we've started this new rights restoration process, which could potentially address some of the complaints that these challengers have raised. Therefore, let's handle this administratively. Let's not do this judicially. The court didn't say anything in their orders list this week. They didn't write separately like they sometimes do to explain their thinking. But I think it is noteworthy that when one of those cases, including one that the court evidently had its eye on enough to do a GVR, nevertheless just dispensed with it after the Department of Justice filed one of those briefs telling the court, please don't take this up.
Yeah. And I think DOJ has set up a pretty easy off-ramp for the court in these cases, right? At least these people will have to go through or try to go through the rights restoration process, although we still don't have any idea how that works or how it's supposed to work. So I don't know how they're supposed to try to go through it. But regardless, they have an alternative now to the court weighing in. And I think the court seems happy to take it, even if they're not explaining themselves as to why.
I say, considering the reduced caseload for the court over the years, I think any opportunity for them to not take something up is probably going to be appealing to them, just based on observation. But it is interesting that this is still going to be an unresolved thing. We still have active cases and active controversies in the lower courts, and evidently neither the federal government nor the Supreme Court seems super eager anyway to clear up that discrepancy. Like you said, the rights restoration process that's supposed to be that off-ramp doesn't really have any details, and the DOJ hasn't responded to our requests for comment. They haven't posted anything publicly about how this is going to actually work. And so we're sort of just going to be in limbo going forward, it seems.
And they haven't given any insight, and it's hard to look at the 10 people they have restored and find any sort of through line there. I mean,
good point.
One of them was a friend of the president, right? Mel Gibson, who had a domestic violence conviction.
One of them was a former New York Jets player, and then the other 8.
I mean, I guess maybe that's the through line is if you're famous enough to be friendly with the president, you might have a good shot perhaps. But that was the accusation from one of the DOJ lawyers who was fired over this, was that, Mel Gibson wasn't part of the original group that was considered, but was added later due to pressure from DOJ leadership. So I don't know. That's, if I was going to give the advice of how the best to maximize your odds, I guess it's get on the president's good side. And that's your, otherwise
get good at football.
We don't know what credit. We don't know what criteria they're using for any of this. Maybe we should. They claim they're going to set out new rules, so maybe they will. But anyway, regardless, having that process at all seems like maybe it is helping them avoid the court taking up these cases. Of course, they've also avoided appealing some of them, like the Range case, which was one we talked about a lot because he was a very high quality plaintiff for the gun rights advocates in this situation. He's not going to have a chance at the Supreme Court, I don't think, as far as I understand it, because that case is not being appealed by the DOJ. So there are multiple ways they're keeping these out. But still one of the bigger stories in terms of gun litigation that have been ongoing since Bruin. So we'll stay on top of whatever happens, whether or not the one particular case ends up catching the Supreme Court's eye, and that remains to be seen. So, but as we're coming up on time here, just briefly touch on some outside of the Reload newsletter links related to the DOJ. Actually, you folks listening probably saw headlines, some particularly apoplectic headlines talking about how the Trump administration just legalized machine guns. That's a little bit exaggerated, but it's referring to litigation over what are called forced reset triggers, which, similar to bump stocks and similar to binary triggers and all these devices and accessories, are meant to take a semi-automatic firearm and not exactly make them automatic, but sort of simulate increased rates of fire. Yeah, right. And this ongoing litigation over this, and I guess the DOJ reached a settlement with the gun rights groups and a particular manufacturer of these triggers to basically say, hey, we're not going to prosecute you anymore. Let's stop the lawsuits. And so they signed a settlement agreement, and that has led to, I think, a lot of consternation in the media and amongst the gun control groups, as you might imagine. Yeah, and maybe a lot of extraneous praise among the gun rights activists, because settlement is not quite as expansive as maybe it sounds like it is on first glance, right? That's my understanding, at least. This is forced reset triggers. Rare Breed is the company that makes them. Similar concept to, bump stocks. It tries to use a different mechanism to just allow you to actuate the trigger faster than you normally would be able to with other traditional shooting techniques. And so it's in that sort of gray area that people have, the ATF has been trying to crack down on last, since Las Vegas, really, since the bump stock ban in the first Trump administration. But that's maybe one of the big problems with this DOJ case is like they're facing a precedent in the bump stock ban case where the Supreme Court essentially said if it doesn't fire more than one round per actuation of the trigger, it's not a machine gun under, the definition in the National Firearms Act, the law we were talking about earlier, which also regulates machine guns in addition to silencers and short barrel rifles. And so, I think the DOJ had maybe an uphill battle here in court, but their settlement the terms of it are kind of interesting, right? Yeah, I read through it, and with the obvious caveat that I'm not a lawyer, but I did read through the settlement and I can read. So there's some interesting pieces in there that basically says, Rare Breed, you're okay to make these things. But one, you have to sort of pinky promise not to make them for handguns. So for whatever reason, you're not allowed to make handgun force reset triggers. The other thing is you have to promise to actively, basically on your own dime, go out and protect your patent on these devices. So if you see someone else trying to make these, you have to go out and take them to court to prevent them from doing so. So it's almost like
not quite, but almost the government trying to enforce a monopoly from this one particular company. Like, you guys are okay to make these. We won't prosecute you, but we reserve the right to go after others. And we hope you go enforce your patent against them. And like you said, the weird thing, I guess, from the perspective of the gun rights movement is that Rare Breed and the gun rights group, it was National Association for Gun Rights in this instance, they won their case at the district court level in Texas. The government appealed that and went to the Fifth Circuit. They had oral arguments last December. And from all the reporting of the oral arguments, it sure seemed like the three-judge panel, they were persuaded that the Cargill case, the bump stock case, also applied, and they were going to deliver a much more sweeping ruling, frankly, that the government can't treat these as machine guns. Right. Yeah. And that would be the upside. And because that no longer is going forward, it prevents that sort of sweeping precedent-setting ruling that these, in fact, are not machine guns, instead of just the DOJ saying, hey, guys, we promise, based on this piece of paper that may or may not hold in subsequent administrations, that we won't go after you.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the criticism I've seen. I think Matt Laurcier, the gun rights lawyer in Florida that we've had on the show a number of times, right, who runs YouTube channel Fudbusters, I think that was one of his main critiques of this settlement, was just that you probably could have gotten a better deal by actually litigating the case all the way through. But they went with the settlement instead. They will still, the company will be able to make and sell these triggers, these trigger devices. So, significant ruling there, or not ruling, but legal settlement. And what's the next piece we got?
Yeah, the other thing is we had an interesting story out of Kentucky from Kentucky Public Radio about one of these. We've seen these many times now. The sort of anti-PLCAA are trying to attach liability to firearms businesses for the crimes committed by third parties. In this case, it's related to that mass shooting that happened at Old National Bank in Louisville, and this is a state court. A state judge actually allowed a lawsuit against the maker of the firearm that was used in that mass shooting to proceed past the dismissal state. So sort of another one of these instances where, at least at the preliminary stage, the gun control groups and folks involved in this have been able to get through liability shields.
Yeah, and for the dealer as well. And I know I've read part of that ruling, and the logic included the idea that, when the shooter went to buy his gun, that he was, shy and not making eye contact and didn't know a lot about firearms. And these were supposed to be red flags for selling him a gun, according to this judge. So, and that they sold him, or that they recommended like a red dot and 30 round magazines, to him when he bought the gun. That seems to be the basis largely of allowing this suit to go forward. The idea that was irresponsible in some way. So interesting ruling. Obviously, that's one of the main things that these gun companies are trying to avoid, is just these cases even getting to, discovery or the second round, because, they cost a lot of money to litigate. And, the goal is not necessarily always to win these cases on the merits for the plaintiffs. It's oftentimes just to litigate them, to get discovery, to be able to publish different, internal documents, or, costs the defendants a lot of money in litigating these things. So that's why even these early stages can be newsworthy, to see whether they can get through that PLCAA protection or state law protection that often also exists. And that's what happened here. And so we'll keep an eye on this one as well. But yeah, just getting through the preliminary stage is an accomplishment for the plaintiffs in these kinds of cases. So that's why it's noteworthy. But I think that's all we've got for this week. In terms of news, I mean, there's lots more, but we can't go on for 2 hours here on this podcast. And, people would listen to that. Although hopefully some of you might, but, either way, I know you've got a trip coming up right next week, so, you won't be around for next week's episode. I will try to carry on without you, but I know you're going to be having some fun, right?
Yeah, I'll be in Europe. So no Jake on the news update next week. So hopefully listeners will be able to do without me for an episode.
Yes, I think we'll be all right. But it's good that you're getting a little bit of vacation in. I imagine they just wrapped up the session there in Colorado. Right?
Yeah, it's is the season for anyone that works in Colorado politics or policy to disappear for a little while after a grueling legislative session.
So you deserve some time off for that, for sure. Because Jake has a full-time job in addition to the work he does here for us at the Reload. So it's good to take some time for yourself every once in a while. But all right, well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. We've got, by the way, on the interview podcast, we have Professor James Allen Fox from Northeastern University, who's going to be talking about another good trend with just 2 weeks in a row on the interview podcast of good news. Last week, we had Jeff Asher, the crime data analyst, talking about how murder may reach an all-time low this year, which is amazing, especially given that we're only a few years removed from a huge spike in the murder rate. But also, James Allen Fox is on to talk about the lack of mass shootings we've seen over not just this year, but really the last year and a half. So, we get his insight on exactly what is going on, and then, some of his thoughts on why it might be happening. So make sure you check that out. It'll be available for Reload members on Sunday, as always, and then everybody else on Monday. So check it out. So go and buy a membership. It's the only way we can do any of this. It's an increasingly difficult financial situation out there for a lot of publications. So, our members really are the reason that we're able to continue on doing this work. So check out our membership options today if you appreciate the kind of reporting that we're doing. And you will also, of course, get early access to the podcast and exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of news and analysis you won't find anywhere else. Head over to reload.com to check that out today. And we'll see you guys again real soon.